Well, we are so happy to have Christina Hoff Sommers with us today to talk about why conservative women should take back feminism. Christina is a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute. Previously, she was a professor of philosophy at Clark University, where she specialized in moral theory. Her articles have appeared in so many publications, including the New England Journal of Medicine and the Wall Street Journal, and many, many others. She's the editor of Vice and Virtue in Everyday Life, a leading college ethics textbook. She's also the author of several books, including Who Stole Feminism? That's when I first got to know her. And it was a great book because she wrote it when they thought you were one of them, right?
I was.
And she could go to all their meetings and everybody spoke very frankly. That's a terrific book. That was sort of mandatory for all our interns to read when they first got with us. She also wrote The War Against Boys, which was the New York Times Notable Book of the Year for 2000. And then she wrote co-authored a book called One Nation Under Therapy. She's appeared on numerous television programs, 60 Minutes, Oprah Winfrey, Comedy Central's The Daily Show, You're Brave.
He was nice.
He was nice to you?
Yeah.
She's also a popular campus lecturer for the Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute. She's lectured and taken part in debates on more than 100 college campuses. And her new book, the flyers for that are outside, Freedom Feminism, Its Surprising History and Why It Matters Today, will be published next month. She got a BA from New York University, a PhD in philosophy from Brandeis University, and she just told me that in December, C-SPAN is filming a 3-hour program on her and her works called Works in Depth. That will be such fun. Go over all your books and all the different things you've done. Christina's been married 27 years. She's the mother of 2 sons, 28 and 40. She looks too young to have 40 years.
It's my stepson.
Okay.
I'm not old enough to have it.
And when she's not working on policy, she likes to cycle, she likes to hike, she likes classical music concerts, and she told me she has singing parties at her house where everybody comes and they sing American classics like Cole Porter and Rodgers and Hammerstein. And
Any good singers here?
what a wonderful lady. Please join me in welcoming Christina Hoff Sommers.
Good afternoon. I am Christina Hoff Sommers from the American Enterprise Institute, and I am delighted to be here. My favorite organizations, the Heritage Foundation, the Clare Boothe Luce Institute, and I just discovered, among its many distinctions, the Clare Boothe Luce Institute was recently audited by the IRS.
2011.
A mark of distinction. They must be doing the right thing. If someone asked you, are you a feminist? Most Americans, if you are like most Americans, you would say no. In large majorities, including large majorities of women, reject the term for themselves. There was a recent survey, 70% of women rejected the label, 17% regarded it as an insult. And it's been in the news over the past couple of years that accomplished modern women as diverse as Taylor Swift, Sandra Day O'Connor, Beyonce, Lady Gaga, Yahoo CEO Marissa Mayer, they all object to the designation feminist. Now, why should that be so? I mean, the emancipation of women is one of the glories of Western civilization. I mean, women organized, fought for, won the right to vote, equality before the law, freedom to pursue an education, to enter any occupation. I mean, feminism is one of the great chapters in the history of human freedom. I mean, why should the term that describes that heritage be in such disrepute? Well, Terry O'Neill, the president of the National Organization for Women, claims that feminists have been unfairly portrayed as, quote, unhappy, angry, and humorless. And these stereotypes, she says, have estranged the younger generation. But my question is, are these generalizations truly unfounded? I mean, consider the famous feminist playwright Eve Ensler. A few years ago, I saw a videotape of her lecturing at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University. And among the many rather eccentric things she said, she suggested that American women, including the young women from Harvard College who were in her audience, arguably among the most privileged and fortunate in the world, she suggested that American women are just as oppressed as those in societies like Iran or Saudi Arabia, societies that practice forced veiling and arranged marriages, or where women can be sentenced to death for adultery. She says, quote, "I think that oppression of women is universal. We are bonded in every single place in the world. I think the conditions are exactly the same," her emphasis. The systemic global oppression of women is complete across the globe. Now consider also the pronouncements of an influential feminist, Bell Hooks. Oh, I meant to show pictures. Well, that's the poll. Okay. That's Eve Ensler. And Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks, very prominent, influential feminist, kind of standard reading in a feminist theory class. She's a distinguished professor of English at City College, and she says, and this is a typical pronouncement, "As long as the United States is an imperialist, capitalist, patriarchal society, no large female majority can enter the existing ranks of the powerful." And she gratefully quotes French feminist Antoinette Fouquet, who calls for the overthrow of the phallic masculine economy. Now, fair or not, feminism is associated in the public mind with hardliners like Ensler and Bell Hooks. And I remember when I was first criticizing feminism, I was reading a lot of feminist textbooks. One came to my attention that was a feminist anthology dedicated, and the author, a feminist philosopher at Washington University, had dedicated the book to the women in my women's studies ovular in the spring of '92, something like that. And I saw the word ovular, and I hadn't heard it before. I was about to look it up until I realized it was an invention. She didn't like the word seminar. So well, its root word is associated with the very essence of male power, so she had replaced it with ovular. Don't think about it. And it was kind of funny, but she wasn't kidding. So what concerns me is that it's Ensler and Hooks and the ovular person, and this kind of philosophy. If you read the typical, not all of them, but typical feminist textbooks, they could be reduced to a slogan. It would be, "Women are from Venus, men are from hell." So there's also a large measure of just sort of male bashing. Now, most women, including those strongly committed to equality, such as myself, we do not think of ourselves as being enthralled to the capitalist patriarchy or held down by a system of global oppression. I mean, Asian women, black women, Latino women, white women, we want our basic rights. But Bell Hooks' call to bring down the capitalist patriarchies is just off-putting. And so I think that today, to identify oneself as a feminist is to claim association with a sort of dire worldview. So women of all colors just keep their distance. And as for men, most of them have just run for cover. Don't find them. Now, some will say, let me just go back to a pleasant site here. Some will say that because the feminist movement has achieved its essential goals, why not just let it fade from the scene? I mean, thank you very much, goodbye. And they would look at the state, the sort of marginal state of the women's movement today and just say, just let it disappear and fall by the weight of its own insignificance. I object to this for 3 reasons. I think it's an understandable but mistaken reaction. I think feminism remains relevant and important in the 21st century for 3 reasons. First of all, women, particularly in the West, did form a movement, and we liberated ourselves. And we did it in ways that are vital to a free society. As I look at all of you, you are emancipated women of the new millennium, and we need to understand how the women's movement succeeded and to where it did well to protect it, to preserve it. Second, and this is probably my most important argument, and I could talk about this all day, and I won't. I'll just very quickly mention it. For most of the world's women, the quest for equality has hardly begun. Across the globe, there are fledgling women's groups who are struggling to survive in the face of just incredible oppression and opposition. I mean, women in Iran, they are the bravest, the women who have organized, they are among the bravest women in the history of the world. I mean, our feminist foremothers, they face some opposition. These women face lashings, imprisonment, rape. It's horrifying. Western women, I believe, have so much to offer. I think we have a responsibility to help. These women are asking for our help. I go to a lot of international women's conferences, and they are pleading for attention, for understanding, for assistance. So I think the success of Western feminism provides a tried and true roadmap for women's liberation in the developing world. And finally, even in the West, the work of feminism is not over. I mean, women far more than men struggle with how to balance home and work. Our popular culture contains many elements of misogyny, and though I think violence against women in this country has certainly gone down, diminished, it continues to exact a terrible toll. And these problems are intractable, they're abiding, and I think the negotiation of the social and sexual relations between men and women is a constant feature of human existence. So the unique circumstances of women require special attention and protections. Let me just see here. Oh, we'll get to that in a minute. So who needs feminism? We do. The world does. But an effective women's movement needs to be rescued from its current outcast state. Anyone who truly cares about improving the status of women around the world should be demanding a women's movement that appeals to most women. Now, for that to happen, I believe that conservative, moderate, and libertarian women are going to have to demand a place at the table. It's my view that there's a style of feminism which is moderate, temperate, inclusive, politically diverse, and sort of reality-based, that could be a source of so much progress in the world. And that indeed is the great lesson of the historic women's movement. And that's what I'm going to talk about, and that's what my little book, Freedom Feminism, is about. There is an entire lost history of conservative feminism. It's a kind of lost continent, but I found it. I went back and found that there were feminist foremothers, and I use the term feminism anachronistically because feminism didn't really, people didn't use the word in the 18th century and most of the 19th century. It's largely came to use in the 20th century. And I also use it to refer to just organized activity on behalf of women's rights and women's interests. So notice there are not a lot of litmus tests, and it doesn't imply a radical worldview of the sort that I quoted in the beginning from Ensler and Hooks. Now, to understand what went wrong and in contemporary feminism and why it is such a marginal movement and why conservatives can set it right, I'm just going to briefly acquaint you with the historical record. The classical feminism in the 18th century and the 19th century embodied two distinct schools of thought. Now, first of all, there was something called egalitarian feminism. It was progressive, as some would say radical. It viewed women as independent agents rather than as wives or mothers or members of families. It held that men and women were, in their essential nature, the same, and it sought to liberate women through appeals to social justice and universal rights. By the way, I'm not denigrating this tradition. This tradition is critical, but I want to mention that it had, there's a sister tradition. The second school, called maternal feminism, was traditionalist, largely religious and family-centered. It embraced rather than rejected women's established roles as homemakers, caregivers, providers of domestic tranquility, and it promoted women's rights by redefining, strengthening, and expanding those roles. So maternal feminism is kind of about an empowered femininity. I just made a little list of the two. Now, of the two schools, what I find so interesting, and by the way, I'm not promoting either one today. I'm simply going to briefly review the historical record, and what I suggest is the most effective feminism, I call freedom feminism, would be an amalgam of the two, take what's best from the two traditions. Now, of the two schools, maternal feminism was by far and away the most popular. Unlike its more radical sister, maternal feminism had enormous appeal to large majorities of women. Now, as I said, both movements were critical to women's progress and struggle for equality. But egalitarian feminism was the more radical, and it had its historical beginnings in the writings of a philosopher, a British philosopher, Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, Wollstonecraft was a fascinating woman. She was a free thinker. She believed that women were as intelligent and as men and as worthy of respect. Her seminal work, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, in 1792 was an instant sensation. She wrote it in the spirit of the European Enlightenment, whose primary principle was the essential dignity and moral equality of all rational beings. And Wollstonecraft had the audacity to suggest that women too are rational. And she said things like, strengthen the female mind by enlarging it, and this will end the blind obedience. Now, at the time Wollstonecraft was writing, there was another woman, far more famous, Hannah More. And she lived from 1745 to 1833. She was a novelist, a poet, a political activist, an evangelical reformer, an abolitionist, and she was waging a very different kind of campaign to improve the status of women. Now, if Wollstonecraft was the founder of egalitarian feminism, More is a founder of maternal feminism. Now, like Wollstonecraft, she was fabulous. She was a self-made woman who had become an intellectual peer of the greatest men of her time. As one biographer notes, in her time, she was better known than Mary Wollstonecraft. Her books outsold Jane Austen many times over. They outsold Thomas Paine. Some historians credit her political writings with having saved England from the kind of brutal revolutionary upheaval that traumatized France in the French Revolution. Now, historians have referred to Hannah More as, quote, a bourgeois progressivist, a Christian capitalist, and the first Victorian. She could also be called, as I said, the first maternal feminist. Now, unlike Wollstonecraft, she believed that the sexes were different and that their propensities, attitudes, and preferences were not the same. She envisioned a society, though, where women's characteristic virtues and graces would be developed, refined, and freely expressed. And she was persuaded that these virtues could only be realized when women were given a first-rate education. And she was a member of the Blue Stocking Circle. You may have heard of the Blue Stockings. These were educated ladies just starved for intellectual nourishment, and they would gather together in salons and discuss important ideas, with men and women, but it was mostly women. She loathed the mindless pastimes that absorbed upper and middle-class women of her day, and she encouraged middle and upper-class women to leave their homes and their salons and take up philanthropic pursuits. Why, asked Hannah More, should women settle for being captivating for a day when they possess the power for actions that, quote, have effects that are commensurate with eternity? According to More, women were more tender-minded than men and natural caretakers of the nation. And she envisioned armies of intelligent, purposeful, well-trained women. She called them domestic heroines, working in hospitals, orphanages, schools. And she appealed to women to exert themselves, quote, with a patriotism once firm and feminine for the greater good of all. And the amazing thing about Hannah More is that women listened. She galvanized the nation. She changed the way women saw themselves. She was a tremendous force behind women's education and women's activism in the public sphere, where women had been sort of confined in the private sphere. She was part of a great movement to take women outside. And this would prove, as women engaged in more and more philanthropic activities, this became an occasion for consciousness raising, so to speak, to use a more contemporary term. Because after that, women began to then want the vote as they were more and more integrated into the larger world. Now, it was taken for granted in Hannah More's time that women were less intelligent, just less serious, just frivolous beings. She adamantly rejected these assumptions. But she did it without rejecting the idea that women had a special connection to the home. She embraced that idea. She embraced the domestic ideal, but she tried to give it greater dignity and power, greater effectiveness. So that was her signature style of conservative feminism. And she initiated a revolution in the relations between the sexes that was very civilized and decorous, and above all, it was a feminism that women could comfortably embrace because it empowered and freed women on their own terms. And if More's name had not been airbrushed out of contemporary women's history, many today might identify with a modernized version of female-friendly feminism. Now, fortunately, her ideals and styles of feminism are well represented in the novels of Jane Austen. Scholars go back and forth about whether or not Jane Austen read Wollstonecraft and Hannah More, but her heroines, the heroines in Jane Austen novels, are paragons. They're kind of Hannah Morean paragons of rationality, mercy, responsible womanhood. And she honored, Hannah More honored a style of marriage, or let's say manhood, that was based on a kind of chivalrous gallant manhood. And Austen's heroes, men like Mr. Darcy or Captain Wentworth, Mr. Knightley, these characters esteem female strength and rationality and intelligence. And if you look at Mr. Darcy or Wentworth, any of them, and you see the women in their lives, there is a complementarity. There's an equality. There's not a subordinate position for the female. So Hannah More, along with Wollstonecraft, played a key role in the struggle for women's emancipation. But More has been forgotten and not part of today's feminist pantheon. Now let's move on to the 19th century, because it happened again. These two forces converged with great success, the egalitarian and the maternalist. Again, we find in the 19th century that women's emancipation was built on two pillars. There were the egalitarians and the maternal feminists. Now, there were egalitarian suffragists, whom I'm sure you've heard of, and they're great women, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony. They promoted women's suffrage through appeals to universal rights. Their inspiration was John Locke, Thomas Paine, Thomas Jefferson, and Stanton wrote very beautifully, affectingly, about, quote, the individuality of each human soul, and on a woman's need to be, quote, the arbiter of her own destiny. And she and her sister egalitarians brought the feminist enlightenment to American women. But to their abiding disappointment, American women greeted the offer with a mixture of indifference and hostility. Stanton's inspiring words resonated with a relatively small coterie of mostly educated women in the East. There was a suffrage amendment which failed dismally in Colorado in 1877, and one newspaper editorial called the suffragists carpetbaggers promoting an elitist Eastern issue, and the headline read, "Goodbye to the female tramps of Boston." This was not good. And the women, sort of went along with it. Enter Frances Willard. Now, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, Frances. Frances Willard was one of the most beloved and respected women of the 19th century America. Well, she was known around the world. She probably was the most famous woman next to Queen Victoria. Because of her prodigious works and her kindly nature, she's often called the St. Francis of American womanhood. Now, she was president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union from 1879 until her death in 1898. Now, today we think of temperance crusaders as sort of grim-faced scolds. You think of Carrie Nation, the 6-foot-tall, hatchet-wielding saloon wrecker. Under Willard's inspired leadership, the WCTU developed into this powerful, effective, philanthropic organization and promoted causes as diverse as the care for the disabled, prison reform, child welfare, as well as suffrage and temperance. And though it was largely a white middle-class organization, it attracted, unlike the other women's groups, the more egalitarian, the WCTU attracted great numbers of Native American, immigrant women, black women. They all had chapters. And according to one study, 30% of its leaders were wives of skilled or unskilled workers, so a lot of working-class women. Most late 19th century social reformers, including Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Sojourner Truth, they supported the ban on alcohol. They were all followers of the temperance movement because temperance advocates believed that banning the sale of alcohol would greatly diminish wife abuse, desertion, destitution, crime. Temperance was really a movement in defense of home and family and the female sphere, because the saloon was seen as the enemy of the home. So it was Willard who brought mainstream women into the suffrage movement, and many historians credit her with doing far more to win the vote than almost any other suffragist. Throughout the 1870s and 1880s, the suffrage movement was in huge trouble, and women were actively organizing against it. The Stanford historian Carl Degler and others believe that the vote was associated in many women's minds as a kind of an attack on their position in the family. And they saw it as a kind of, it was viewed as kind of selfish and an attack on the family. If the American women's movement was going to move forward, the suffrage movement needed new arguments, new ways of thinking that were more respectful and protective of women's role. And Frances Willard showed the way. With the vote, said Willard, women can greatly increase their civilizing influence on society. With the vote, they can protect the homes they dearly loved. She referred to the ballot as the home protection ballot. And women were moved by her arguments. And you'll find a lot of feminist historians who will say, oh, it was so terrible. In the 19th century, women were viewed as the angel in the house. But the truth is, and Degler shows this so beautifully in his history, a lot of women liked being angels in the house. And for many of them, it constituted a huge improvement. We see that as women were taking over the private sphere and freed from the hard labor of the farm, their life expectancy increased, their overall health was enhanced, and so when women begin to see that they saw the egalitarian feminists somehow threatening that. And but Willard had a different appeal, which was respectful of family, and her followers began to bring the suffrage movement something it was not accustomed to: electoral victories. In 1890, because she would tell them, women, you must vote to protect your home, your children. And as I said, women were galvanized and men were disarmed, but I didn't know what to say. In 1893, the state of Colorado had a second election on women's suffrage. Now, unlike 1877, when the suffragists lost and the so-called tramps of Boston were sent packing, this time the suffragists won by a 55% majority. And many historians agree that Willard's conservative approach made all the difference. She had persuaded large numbers of men and women that it was a mother's sacred duty to vote. Now, both the egalitarian and maternal feminist paths have been indispensable to women's progress. But maternal feminism has always had a wider appeal. And I even see this today in the Muslim world. There are maternal feminists, and the egalitarian feminists have always been there through the 19th, 20th century. They've had egalitarian feminists in places like Egypt and Yemen and Iran. But today there's I recently read an account with all these interviews of sort of women struggling for their rights in the Muslim world. And one woman in particular said, well, we don't really want to do what American feminists, we like being mothers and wives, but we want our rights. And the author called it, I think she called it difference feminism, but it was maternal feminism. And I recognize that in the developing world right now, they have their Elizabeth Cady Stantons and Susan B. Anthonys, but they also have their Frances Willards. And Frances Willards are more successful right now in generating support and enthusiasm for the cause. So both the egalitarian and feminist paths have been indispensable to women's progress. As I said, I'm not denigrating the egalitarian. We needed them. But we needed both paths. To galvanize great majorities of women, you can't be insulting their way of life. And there was an uneasy alliance. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was always nervous about Frances Willard. She was the more radical of the two, and Susan B. Anthony just worshipped her. So Susan usually got her way, so they did make common cause with Frances Willard. The uneasy alliance between the progressives like Wollstonecraft and the conservative Moore in the 18th century and Stanton and Anthony with Willard in the 19th century, this led to momentous improvements in women's lives. So what happened next? This is all described in my little book, my little monograph, so I'm not going to go through what happened in detail, but the next 40 years, it was actually maternal feminism which was most alive. After women won the vote for the next 40 years, there was a maternal feminist movement in the labor movement that tried to get a lot of protective legislation for women and protecting pregnant women and so forth, and children. But then egalitarianism came back with a vengeance with the ERA. And just to very quickly summarize what happened, initially, as in the past, the ERA, in fact, a lot of laws were changed. Even before the women started marching in the streets, there were Republicans and Democrats that got together and passed the Equal Pay Act. A very Republican Supreme Court passed one law after the other. Even feminists refer to these early days in the 60s as a golden age. And these were mostly Republican men, encouraged by Republican and Democratic women, I will say. And Democratic men were not really on board with this, but so the ERA came along, and some of you will know this. Initially, it had strong support, maybe stronger support from Republicans. Eisenhower, Nixon, Gerald Ford supported it. But on one occasion, Phyllis Schlafly, who was well, she calls herself just a housewife from Alton, Missouri, but she was a housewife who had 6 children, and had written a number of best-selling books, was a lawyer, and was about to organize a grassroots campaign, which would go into in history books, is maybe the most successful in our history. And I interviewed Ms. Schlafly for this book, and I wanted to get it straight. I said, how did you get into this whole thing? Because she was really involved in, she was worried about strategic balance, and she was an expert on armaments. During the war, she had a job where she was full-time job testing munitions in a munitions factory. And a friend of hers who owned a bookstore in Connecticut invited her to come and debate the ERA. And Schlafly said, well, I don't even know if I'm against it. And she wasn't opposed. She wasn't opposed to the Equal Pay Act and women having careers. She had a dazzling career herself. But her friend said, well, just read it. And anyway, Phyllis read it. And then she read a little more deeply, and she realized that a lot of Americans, politicians, everyone was eager to sign on to the ERA because they thought it was sort of emblematic of goodwill toward the women of the country. But she saw there was a very different agenda in the National Organization for Women. She had read Betty Friedan's Feminist Mystique. There are some good things in that book, but there is such derision, bordering on hatred of housewives and mothers. I mean, Friedan notoriously referred to stay-at-home mothers as walking corpses and compared them to inmates in concentration camps. And there were a huge amount of protest letters. American women did not see themselves that way. And what Phyllis Schlafly realized is that these women's groups were going to use the ERA to enforce their rather bizarre worldview. And there's a fantastic tape of Phyllis Schlafly is on firing line, Bill Buckley, to debate the ERA. And here are the words of the ERA. And William F. Buckley reads this to her, and you can see he thinks it's reasonable, and he's prepared to think maybe Schlafly's unreasonable. And there was a lawyer from the National Organization for Women there. And Phyllis just explained they want women to be drafted into combat. And they're not going to allow things like single-sex schools or mother and son, mother and father and daughter dances. It's all out. And Schlafly had been criticized for caricaturing the ERA, and so Buckley thought maybe she was doing that, and then he asked the representative from Now, and she said, women should be in combat. We are equal, and then Buckley said, well, wait a minute, Miss, I forget her name, Miss National Organization for Women. He said, surely it would be all right for women to join the military voluntarily, but you're not insisting that they be drafted into combat. She was. And so Phyllis was just, went around and found a way to tell that to state legislators, and sentiment changed very quickly. She got her message out. Now, and as you know, the ERA went down to defeat. Against all odds, it went down to defeat because people suddenly realized it was not what it appeared. What it was the hardcore egalitarianism at war with maternal feminism, giving it absolutely no purchase, no place, outlawing it essentially. And that really means kind of outlawing what most women want. Because the fact is that, and here's the central paradox for egalitarian feminism, is that when women are liberated from the domestic sphere, granted our full Lockean, Jeffersonian freedoms to pursue happiness, we're no longer sequestered in that role as nurturer. It turns out that many, perhaps more, continue to give priority to the domestic sphere. I mean, despite feminist disapproval, most Americans have now made peace with women's preference And there does seem to be, you look at Pew Foundation studies of what women want, and a vast majority of mothers prefer part-time work or not to work at all. And the wealthier women are, the more successful and educated, the less they want to work full-time when they have children. This has not changed. This hasn't even changed in Sweden, where they've been trying for generations to impose a gender-neutral society. They've gone so far as, well, one fanciful feminist wanted to have gender-neutral toilets where the men would be forced to sit down. This was supposed to, they've gone farther than anybody. They have schools where children, where there's no gender, there's no he or she, and all the stories have been rewritten about, an alligator meets a reptile, meets a mouse, and they have a ostrich. All these, there's everybody. It's diverse. They've tried to eliminate gender. Has not worked in Sweden. In fact, Sweden has such generous policies for women. You can work part-time. You get generous family leave. That most women like it and choose to stay home. Or they choose to work part-time. They don't stay home entirely. But so after the ERA went down, what happened was the ERA refugees, they did not learn the lesson that they should re-engage with maternal feminism. They should address the actual practical issues of post-liberation womanhood. They were mortified, absolutely mortified by the loss. They retreated into advocacy groups, research centers, women's studies programs, law schools, and they used their considerable skills to aggressively push their agenda by other means. And most of those, not everyone, but I would say most of the feminists inside lobbying groups today, like NOW or the AAUW, they are hardline egalitarians. And the feminist theorists inside the university, they're even more radical. They don't even like the liberal tradition because they think it's elitist and capitalist and so forth, and they endorse a lot of theories that derived from Karl Marx. And that's where you get Eve Ensler, perhaps, but certainly bell hooks. But the feminist theorists, so there we are today, is that the radical egalitarians and their Marxist friends, they have tenure. They own the tenure system, essentially, and they have a monopoly on the discourse on women. They own, the kind of women's brain trust. There's 116 women's organizations, and they disseminate the knowledge on women, and they come from this tradition. They aren't even, they're not, in my mind, many of them are not even in the tradition of Wollstonecraft and Stanton. They're much more radical and intolerant of women who are more of the maternal feminist side. But anyway, a flourishing women's movement has to have these two sides. It has to have a conservative and a liberal wing. And today, all we have is a radical wing. More than that, women appear to make their greatest progress when conservative women are at the helm. Society changed fundamentally because of Hannah More and Frances Willard, far more than it would have done if they hadn't been there. Moderate and conservative women, they corrected the excesses of their more radical colleagues. You need the radical, sort of vanguard, and some of the things they will say will be sound, and some of them will be the opposite of sound. And they, I think conservatives also have kept the women's movement anchored in practical reality and in mainstream sensibilities. So my new book, Freedom Feminism, ends with an action guide of how conservative, moderate, and libertarian women can reform feminism. And I will end the discussion by offering two suggestions to you, all of you here today. And number one is to take back feminism. Number two, if a pollster calls and asks, are you a feminist? You can say, yes, I'm a freedom feminist. A freedom feminist, it allows that men and women are different. We don't want to impose, on the one hand, we don't want to impose rigid gender roles on anyone, but we recognize that a lot of women will happily inhabit those roles. So it's about freedom. It's about choice. And finally, I will say this section of the ovular is over. I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Do about 15 minutes of questions.
Oh, okay, I went over.
What a great talk. Now, those of you who are in college, can you imagine ever hearing that point of view in your Women's Studies Center on your campus? It's outrageous that you don't, and that you can't. And even when you try to get them to bring in a different point of view, we've had so many women students who try to work with them to bring in different, they refuse. They don't even answer the emails. They pretend like the conservative women don't exist.
Oh, they won't debate you. I will say that in doing this book, I have discovered some fantastic sort of scholars underground in women's studies who have studied Hannah More and Frances Willard and the election in Colorado in 1877. These are fantastic scholars there, but they're not ideologues. It's the ideologically inflamed feminists that set the tone in women's studies. But they're, at UCLA especially, I found these scholars from the 18th century, experts on the blue stockings, who are wonderful, and they secretly helped me with the book. I don't know if they want to be associated with it, but.
If you wouldn't mind, these are two Claire Booth interns, if you'd give your name and your affiliation. Ann Stone has the first question. Look out.
Thank you. What do you mean, look out?
I know, Anne. We agree.
Christina's a friend. And in fact, Michelle, as you know, I'm one of the founders of the National Women's History Museum, and I want to say thank you so much for this talk in getting women's history out. I want to tweak what you said just a little bit. Start with Christine de Pizan, who's the first person in the 1400s that actually tried to fight misogyny and
Yes.
put forward women's rights. And there actually were 5 movements to try to mainstream women's accomplishments and the rights of women over time coming up to present, and they all failed. And that's why women's history has been lost. And these wonderful people, Wollstonecraft and Moore, are absolute idols of mine. I love them. But when you get to modern feminism, I know Joan Kennedy Taylor was a friend, and she wrote Reclaiming the Mainstream. I would take some of what she has, along with your pamphlet, which I look forward to reading immediately, and say that there's some intersection, but also she makes a point that even in the egalitarian, there are 2 types. There are the individualist feminists that are egalitarian, that are our people, and then there are the social feminists. And the feminists had a break in the late 60s. And if they had never had that break and the more radical social feminists had not taken over, we probably all would be feminists, would have been calling ourselves feminists all along. But that's when the gay rights agenda and all that took hold of now and all of that, and you had the real radical departure and a real split in feminism. So I would say, please don't rule out all the egalitarians, because there are a lot that are libertarian or individualist feminists that are definitely our
I
allies.
completely agree, and I hope I conveyed, I'm such an enthusiast for Mary Wollstonecraft and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and their modern day followers, and those Republican women who were so active in passing the Equal Pay Act and so forth. They were probably not maternal feminists, many of them were reasonable egalitarians, and but I had a little space, so I had to get a lot in it, and it's hard to make distinctions.
This is very important, and it also, what you're talking about, goes in with Sheryl Sandberg in her book, which the left has decried, and the right should totally embrace. I said this at an IWF forum a couple of weeks ago, and that is that Sandberg actually stabs a knife into the heart of victimhood, which has been a centerpiece of modern feminism. And I had people on that panel say, oh, that's not true. The feminists have always encouraged women to be individuals. No, they haven't. They've encouraged them to be in their agenda, within a corral on their plantation. They didn't want freedom feminism. So I think this is wonderful what you're doing. I look forward to talking to you possibly about doing an article for the museum and working with us further on it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Down here.
I just want to say I'm very excited to get your book. I'm sorry they're not here today, but it'll be fun.
They're
when we
almost
can
here,
come
right,
They're
Stuart?
almost here. Anyway,
Next
but,
one.
I know I was aware of the fact that there's a link with the Republican Party and I'm guessing it was a maternal feminist, but I know Susan B. Anthony, when she was able to sneak through and cast a ballot, the press asked her, what ballot did you cast? And she says it was straight up a Republican ticket. And I know that Woodrow Wilson, our president, he's the one who threw a bunch of feminists into the Lorton Workhouse. And it's very interesting, this was a Democrat that threw the feminists who just wanted the right to vote into prison. And they did some horrible things to those women in there with force feeding them and all of this.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it is maddening to think that somehow the Democrats hijacked our Republican legacy.
Yeah.
And so there's a plaque down at the Lorton Workhouse, which they recently put up our local state senator is Barker, and so he's a Democrat. And so his wife was part of a group of Democratic ladies who had this little plaque put up, but it's like, no, this is not the Democrats' legacy, this is the Republicans' legacy. And so I feel like we need to take back what is the Republic, I mean, they've managed to somehow bury the fact that the early feminist movement in America was Republican.
Absolutely,
based.
and we have to reclaim that history, and even more, like fairly recently, there was a movie about William Wilberforce, and people suddenly realized that the abolitionism in England came out of an evangelical group, sort of intellectual evangelicals called the Clapham sect, and William Wilberforce was just this magnificent, heroic figure who had seen these slave ships go coming in, and he made it his business to find out what was going on, and he is considered one of the fathers of abolitionism. He was friends with Hannah More. She was in the Clapham sect. And so even Christian evangelicals have this tradition that in England that was the beginning of women's emancipation. But very few people know it. I mean, people think of feminism and think of people burning bras or, I don't know, being outrageous. And there's this, as I said, this lost history of conservative and religious leaders. Yes.
I know Ann has one more question, but let's try some other people.
The Republicans, in their Growth and Opportunity Report, under the section on women, point 10, reclaiming their history. They intend to take it back. They're having a series of events outside of Women's History Month, so if you want to talk to me about that, they very much want to do that.
Oh, and go back and look at all of those Supreme Court cases where women, just one thing after another, they just took off the books so many sexist laws, and it happened with a mostly Republican Supreme Court under Republican presidents, and it's all kind of forgotten.
Over here.
I'm Colette Caprera from Heritage. I want to thank you. It was great, your presentation and your book. I just have a musing, and I wondered what you thought, but since the 60s, there was a big reaction against men who were like corporate men, or their value was in the corporation or their career. So, but for books like Lean In, it seems like women's value a lot of times by people who are getting popular recognition is limited to what they've done with their careers or how far they've gone up the corporate ladder.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you could say anything about that dichotomy. And I had a tail-end question, too, because you used the term airbrushed out. I wondered why we don't, because we know the liberating men who wrote in those same years is Hannah More and Frances Willard. But what did happen? Why did it go underground? So two different questions.
Well, for the first, and I tried it when I go to campuses, and a lot of women's studies students come. The professors rarely come, but their students sometimes come for some reason. And I was recently at the University of Maryland, and the whole audience seemed to be sort of hardline women's studies majors. And what I tried to tell them is that if they would make the movement more inclusive. I mean, it's kind of an unwritten rule now. The Women's Center is it's supposed to be a safe place for women. It's not. It's a safe place for radical feminists. But if you were a conventionally religious woman or moderate or a libertarian, it would be a hostile environment. And that has to change. And younger women will listen to that. They care about being inclusive, and they can imagine that maybe they should be inclusive, like politically and religiously, as well as with ethnicity and so forth. But then I try to tell them how much good we could do. There are issues like this, like just that there's sort of one model for success, which is climbing the corporate ladder. And I cheer on those women who become CEOs. It's fantastic. But on the other hand, I think it's very wrong to present that model as, and I don't blame. I mean, Sandberg doesn't do that, but a lot of people do. It's as if the women's movement just has one model of success. It's full-time careerism, and there's not I've never seen a poll that shows that a majority of women are committed careerists anywhere in the world. And as I say, even in Scandinavia, and certainly not in Holland, they all work part-time. Their government policies allow them to do that. And that's what women seem to want under conditions of freedom. And so I think that if we could break down these barriers, there are issues that conservative and liberal women could, like violence against women. I mean, that's tends to be a lot of the research is unreliable, and hardline feminists use the research to prove that American society is ruinous for women, and so they tend to exaggerate. But why not just tell the truth? Won't women be helped by good research, by reality-based studies, rigorous? It's not going to implicate the average man in a social atrocity, because the average American male is not a predator, a rapist, and a small percentage are, and we need policies to prevent them from wreaking havoc and misery. But so that's something we could agree on. And then most of all, making common cause with women in the developing world. I mean, there are millions of evangelical women, traditionally Catholic women, who would never call themselves feminists, yet their heart goes out to those women. They already have a lot of philanthropies, but there's not that much cooperation. And that was my idea. If the more radicals would cooperate with the conservatives on issues around which we agree, even the misogyny in the popular culture or the hookup culture or something, these could be done. History suggests we could succeed if we'd cooperate.
Okay, maybe we'll make this the last one, and then we'll talk informally over lunch.
Hi, my name is Amanda Morris. I'm with the Fund for American Studies. And I guess my question is, I feel like the elephant in the room when you discuss feminism and conservatism is abortion. And especially in light of the past election where their whole war on women propaganda started popping up. What do you think is the best way forward for people who identify as conservative feminists when the abortion issue comes up? It just seems like it's something we never get right.
Well, the first thing to know about the abortion issue is that Americans are pretty evenly divided on it. And with women, there are about half want a liberal policy and half are pro-life. And very few Americans want just abortion on demand. You'll find, even among Democrats, there are very few. So I look at that issue, and I look at it as a philosopher. It's a fundamental moral dilemma, because there are two moral principles that collide. For some, the sanctity of life takes precedence, and everyone wants to believe in the sanctity of life. But there's also the principle of compassion for a woman, who's in a hopeless condition, and your heart goes out to her and wants to help her. So for some people, they're driven more by compassion, and they override the principle of life, and others. And we can argue forever. One thing I will say is that though the younger generation is becoming far more liberal on gay rights and any number of issues, they're increasingly conservative about abortion. And I think any thoughtful person, and I've heard atheist philosophers at Oxford University who, don't have any religious interest in the question, they're still philosophically hesitant to endorse an absolute permission for something like abortion, and in the third trimester, that sort of thing. They see that there are moral reasons. So what I'm saying is, I think that probably most women's groups, unless you specifically want to educate on that issue, should agree to disagree and find things. There's so many important causes that are not dilemmas, that are not, a collision of two fundamental moral principles, and we can advance so many good causes, and so I think for a large women's group, there should be. And I think the Independent Women's Forum has done a good job. They just don't debate it and acknowledge that women differ. And so that's what I would suggest. On the other hand, if you want to have a pro-life group or a pro-choice group specifically, that of course you should do that. And but groups like NOW and the AAUW, they kind of have a litmus test. If you're pro-life, you're not welcome.
We are pro-life at Clare Boothe Luce, but I want to tell you, one of the most compassionate, one of the most adamant pro-life people I know is one of our other campus speakers, Bay Buchanan. She's also one of the most compassionate women when it comes to talking to young women who have gotten in a jam, who've gotten pregnant and all that. So I would just say that you can be firm. If you believe it's a human life, well, you have to keep your conviction, but have Bay come to your school, or Bay or Christina. Bay is so excellent on that, whereas she is very strong on the issue, but she understands what happens to young women. So you can do both.
You can do
It's
both.
not
And
a-
that's very good. That's very good to explain it that way, although they'd come up with another principle of autonomy or something. But I'll just end with this. I had my first job was teaching philosophy at Clark University, and philosophy departments, you will, for the most part, have not fallen to political correctness because the philosophers are just too ornery and independent and cantankerous. And that department was so diverse, and I was like the most liberal member. But I had a friend, Patrick Durr, and his wife. They were religious Catholics and very active in the pro-life movement, and they had 5 or 6 children, and it made the women's studies professors just so nervous to be. She was pregnant again, and they were just horrified. And then I discovered that in their home, they had this little house, and they had all these kids, and they were taking in mothers to live there. And they had foster children. I mean, it was a model of compassion. So I agree that it's very complicated and nuanced, and all of these things changed me in terms of how I view the issue. So.
Right. And if you would like this wonderful woman to come to your campus, those of you who are at college, I hope you'll contact us. Catherine Rodriguez there, raise your hand, Catherine. Catherine will help you every step of the way. In fact, she gives a seminar, how to have a successful campus lecture. Everything from money to scheduling to everything. I know you have one more in, but we got to move on to lunch here.
Or lunch.
When you go to campuses, please get women to major in women's history and conservative, because what you said is right. We need more women in women's history.
I can't imagine a more torturous thing than as they currently exist. Can you imagine?
Well, you have to change that. And the thing is, graduate students don't have anything to write about. You have a lot to write about.
But I mean, for this, you're going to pay tens of thousands of dollars. We have some wonderful gifts for you because you are one of our favorites here. We have our limited edition Clare Boothe Luce Policy Institute coffee mug with a famous saying. Some of you know, what is it? What did she say?
No good deed goes unpunished.
And we have our, especially for maternal feminists,
Oh,
tote bag
good.
to carry all your gifts.
And I'll give you one more. This is from Heritage. I know you're an author, so you probably have a number of books. But you wrote the history of feminism, conservative feminism, right? We're going to give you a history of the Heritage Foundation.
Oh, thank you.
Leading the way for those of you who haven't seen it, which we just had Ed Fulmer step down
Yes.
earlier this year after 36 years. But this is a story of that, and many of the conservative groups that are in here are in this book.
Oh,
so that's kind of
thank
fun
you.
too. Thank you
very
very
nice.
much
Thank
for
you
being
very
with
much.
us, Christina. Thank you.
And the Heritage Foundations provide a wonderful lunch for us right out in the hall where we can talk informally and have a good meal.